A very sunny good morning to colleagues who join from Scotland, and a very good afternoon to colleagues who join from various parts of the colonies known as Australia. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Jo Barraket and I'm the Director of Melbourne Social Equity Institute, and it's my great pleasure to be with you today. Given where we are broadcasting from, I want to start by handing over to my colleague, Associate Professor Emma Lee from the Centre for Social Impact, Swinburne, to do an acknowledgement of traditional owners. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you, dear Jo. Palingana, hello and welcome. I'm coming to you from Blair Hickey Hill of Plew country, which is northwest Tasmania. I pay respects to ancestors, elders, communities of Wurundjeri country, Kulin nations and Naarm, City of Melbourne. We acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people never ceded sovereignty. And we also respect caring for country that has given us our lands and waters that we live, reside, have our families work on. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. We're really happy to see so many of you joining us today, and I imagine that there'll be a few more coming through the virtual doors as we get started. We're deliberately in Zoom meeting rather than Zoom webinar today so that we can have a little bit more access to each other's faces, etc. So if you do want to turn your cameras, if you do want to turn your microphones and cameras on towards the end of the session when we are doing the opportunity for discussion about the work, we'd be really happy to do that. In the meantime, please feel free to use the chat function to say hello, let us know where you're from, and we're really happy to have you here and to collect any comments and reflections you have as we go along through the session. So feel free to use that chat function with abandon. Before we get into the webinar, I just wanted to do a couple of housekeeping things. First, to acknowledge that we are recording this session today until we get to the end of the formalities by way of the material that myself and colleagues will be sharing with you. We do want to stop the recording a bit later on because we are really keen to see an opportunity for frank discussion and disclosure if people want to do that. Also to note that we have scheduled an hour and a half formally in the invitation, but we certainly don't expect that we'll use that full time. We just wanted to make sure that there was an opportunity for anyone who was particularly revved up by this work and the issues that are raised to have an opportunity to chat with each other and with us. But we would expect that we'll be completed within about just over an hour and 10 minutes. That's the plan. The other thing I think I just wanted to acknowledge was really what the goals of today's webinar are. If you've come along for a highly formalised presentation filled with graphs and numbers related to amounts of spend associated with social procurement, you might be slightly disappointed. One of the key areas of focus in this is that it is an interim set of reflections on a project that's ongoing. And while that project does include some material associated with numbers, that's not the core focus for today. Really what we wanted to do is provide some interim reflections and use that as an opportunity to have the kinds of conversations that we think are needed to ensure that the implementation of social procurement policies is really fantastic. In terms of what the content of the webinar will include, I'm going to provide a bit of an overview of the project, and then I will reflect on, just very briefly, on a comparative analysis of the formal aspects of the policy designs in the two jurisdictions that we're looking at, which is Victoria and Scotland. I will then be passing on to my colleague, Professor Michael Roy, who will be providing some reflections on our insights and his experience in Scotland. And Michael will then be passing on to Associate Professor Emma Lee, who is going to provide some reflections on key storylines that we've heard from Victorian Aboriginal businesses in the work that we've done to date. I'll wrap it up with just a few brief tying together reflections, and then it's open to you. So we're really keen as we go through this process today for you to be not simply consuming the information that we are sharing, but being with us as active citizens in this work, if that's useful to you. We're keen to hear your reflections, your experiences on what we think is really interesting but somewhat challenging terrain in relation to social procurement policy implementation. I'd like to start very briefly by acknowledging that it takes a village to do an Australian Research Council Discovery Grant project, and that village comprises the people who generously contribute to the research, the people who advise the researchers from the project advisory group, and all the members of our research team. I'm not going to go through names, but you can see those there, and just my acknowledgement and gratitude to everyone who's helped co-produce this thus far, and my acknowledgement to colleagues from the research team who are with us in the so-called audience. If you would like to weigh in at any time, please feel free to do so. In terms of the project overview, I guess while this project has become a lot more than my individual insights, where it started for me was that when the Victorian Social Procurement Framework was introduced, I was at that time the director of the Centre for Social Impact at Swinburne University, and one of the very quick things that happened was a large number of organisations, largely from the corporate sector, approached our organisation to talk about how they could measure their social impacts. And while I do have some expertise in that area, my key response and reaction to that was, gosh, this is going to take some serious implementation before anyone gets to questions of outcomes and impact, and maybe looking at the implementation questions is the first thing that needs to happen. So that was the starting point for what then became, obviously, through our team, a much larger set of questions. And the very big picture question is, how can we make policy reforms that involve lots of different actors from lots of different sectors, from lots of different organisational cultures come together to tackle big social problems? How can we make those kinds of policy reforms work? Social procurement is one exemplar of this kind of policy reform. Certainly not the only one, but the one that we've focused on. And if you're worried that we're going to talk a lot about general issues to do with policy reform, we're not. We are going to focus on social procurement. So just very briefly, noting that we've got a lot of huge experts and knowledgeable people in this group, really what we are talking about in relation to social procurement is using purchasing power to generate public and social value above and beyond the value of goods that are purchased. And our focus, as I've already intimated, has been particularly on Scotland and Victoria and their particular policy frameworks in this piece of work. Why that comparison? Noting that there are some cultural and logistical reasons why comparative work between these two jurisdictions is not appropriate. We did think that there was some value in looking at them together because the Scottish government is known for being a world leader in this area of work, and Michael will speak a little bit more about the detail of this, but noting that the Victorian Social Procurement Framework was partly informed by developments in Scotland, as well as local needs and local political goals, as well as the advent of the Indigenous procurement policy at national level, which through the former Council of Australian Governments had been adopted at that time. In terms of our approach, I think while we're not going to get too much into theory today, we did want to acknowledge that really I think where we started from with this is that social procurement is a manifestation of new public governance and an emergent interorganisational field. So what do we mean by new public governance? For those of you who are not too interested in theory, but just want to know the very headline ideas, I guess new public governance is quite popular in policy studies and public management, and recognises that the traditions of Western governing are now increasingly layered. So within Western traditions of governing, we started with bureaucracy or hierarchy. We then moved on in the 1980s to new public management, which is characterised by a focus on markets. And then more recently, new to Western forms of governing, but certainly not new to governing, we've had a stronger focus on networks and collaboration. And new public governance recognises that public policy and governing in contemporary Western contexts is actually a mishmash of all of those ways of governing, and it's involved increasing plurality of non-government actors involved in the doing of public policy and public management. The project's also informed by respect for Indigenous methodological principles of deep listening, holistic worldviews and reciprocity, and that's guided by Emma, and I'll leave that to her to discuss in her part of the webinar. In terms of the project, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that we've had just a few challenges. COVID's affected many of the organisations, governments and people who have been involved in this project in fairly extreme ways. And that doesn't exclude the researchers, but isn't certainly not purely about the researchers. We've also had a few bumps because I had the temerity to move universities, and that's meant that the project's grant has been held up during transfer. So it hasn't allowed us to do our reciprocity in quite the way we want to, but we're now back on track and looking forward to the next steps. And also collaborating across time zones, as colleagues who are on here from Scotland, where it's 7:13 in the morning, is obviously difficult. And that's been a very not insignificant challenge. In terms of our project timeline, just really quickly, this covers off on the various aspects of the work that have been involved. We started with policy analysis, looking at documents, not only the policy, the frameworks, but associated policy documentation to do with social procurement in the two jurisdictions, and interviews with people who'd been actively involved in the development design of those policies. We moved on to workshops with people from various stakeholder groups or parts of the emerging field, including people who are involved in organisations that supply under social procurement at all levels, people who are doing the procuring, and also policymakers. We're in a process at the moment of doing in-depth interviews across both jurisdictions, with most of them done in Scotland and a few more to do in Victoria. And we also plan to do some sense-making workshops once we've brought more of this data together, so that that's one of our invitations today for people who may be interested, is we would like to actually do some processing of this data with people who are interested in the field, so that we can make sense of it together. Just as new public governance involves a bit of a mishmash of governing regimes, one of the things we see from a research perspective is there are diverse perspectives and diverse truths going on in relation to what we're seeing, and we'd like to invite others to help us make sense of those. This is just a quick summary of our research participants across both the jurisdictions, and relates to, you know, my earlier comment about the sort of diversity of people who we've heard from and who've contributed to date. My very quick overview of comparative insights into policy design, which is based on the work that we did at the beginning of the project, looking at policy documents and also those interviews with key informants who'd been involved in design. I don't want to go through it in huge detail, but just to pick up a few things. The first is that we do see in the Scottish context, in terms of policy framing and goals, a focus on social justice and inclusive growth through collective spending power. In Victoria, the focus has been a little bit inflected towards inclusive employment and equality of opportunity for people and businesses in social equity priority groups, if you like, in particular through social enterprises and Victorian Aboriginal businesses. In terms of who's been involved in terms of the ways in which people have been involved in the policy development, in Scotland, there's been a relatively stronger emphasis on active involvement of stakeholders, whereas in the Victorian context, the emphasis has been on extensive consultation. And for those of you who think, oh, these are just words, Michael has some reflections in his part of the session, but also just to note that this is not just us picking out words from the policies, but actually the interview material, the interview contributions that people provided as well. In terms of the primary instruments of policy implementation, unsurprisingly, contracts and competitive tendering, which sit at the centre of most accepted forms of procurement, were central instruments in both policies. But in the Victorian context, government department compliance is also an active part of the framework. In terms of the focus on the kinds of capability development that's needed in a emerging field of social procurement, we're interested to observe that in the Scottish context, the formal emphasis has been on developing the capabilities of the public sector staff involved in these processes, whereas in the Victorian context, the emphasis has been on building the capability of private providers, including providers from the corporate sector through to our for-benefit suppliers. So that just gives you a quick overview of some of those key differences. And I'm now going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to Michael so that he can provide his insights.
Morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Jo. I am going to share my screen and hopefully you can all see that. There we go. Okay, so a quick run through on Scotland, and I'm literally going to spend 10 minutes. Jo has given you a very comprehensive overview of the kind of themes that are emerging. However, what I wanted to do is just really kind of emphasise that this kind of makes sense. You know, that we've had emigration to Victoria, between Scotland and Victoria, for quite some time, heading back to colonial times, the height of colonial times, if you like. But even in the run-up to the 2014 Glasgow Commonwealth Games, our First Minister, Jack McConnell, at the time, Jack McConnell, visited Victoria in an attempt to kind of call the Victoria-Scotland relationship a kind of sister state relationship, which I thought was quite interesting language. But in the run-up to the Commonwealth Games, social procurement was a key element of that. Actually, it was a key driver of a lot of the policy implementation or policy development we saw later. So this is the Emirates Arena in Glasgow, and I know a social enterprise was given the contract for the when they were building the catering, etc., related to this. So with the Work Integration Social Enterprise who did that. And as Jo says, the Procurement Reform Scotland Act was really world leading. It was thought to place Scotland at the forefront of social procurement policies globally. Whether that's the truth or not doesn't really matter. That's what was said kind of at the time. Sorry, I'm just trying to negotiate the cameras as well as here we go, right. So as Jo says, with a variety of different policy key documents, with our economic strategy, which placed social procurement at the heart of that, and we had a specific social procurement strategy in terms of efforts to help embed particularly a living wage and focusing on sectors with pay as low or indeed zero. We have 0-hour contracts with quite a few of those. Then we had the Procurement Reform Scotland Act 2014, and more recently we've had community wealth building starting to emerge, and social procurement is a large plank of that, and emphasises the role of key anchor institutions. So you know, key players in the public sector, universities, local authorities, the NHS, so on and so forth, trying to keep wealth as local as possible. So social procurement is a key driver in that. That's still to emerge fully, but that's an emerging big strategy now. So yes, as Jo said, there are 4 overarching themes around values, ensuring that the social goals are embedded at various stages of the procurement process. activate key players and build capacity, so build a coordinated cross-sectoral approach. Have people engaging in the policy development or policy cycle, so people at all levels, from deliverers through to policymakers, commissioners, procurement officers, and so on and so forth, and indeed in the policy implementation phase as well of that. So we spoke to policy influencers. So this was people involved in a kind of policy advisory committee on social procurement. So we had Federation of Small Businesses, trade unions, key social enterprise support bodies, and so on. And they were involved in the formalisation of a lot of the policies here. So it was quite a kind of consultative process, I suppose. And this is because policy development and implementation in Scotland generally tends to be highly relational rather than transactional. And what we found was that findings included that the desire for change came from frustrations with navigating complex systems and a desire for a one-stop shop for social procurement. So a number of policies then came into play, such as Ready for Business and Partnership for Procurement, but we had policy pressure at quite the highest level on this to have change. So how the policies are considered? Well, what they're saying is it's guidance, but it's not enforced by law, which presents problems. There is a pressure to implement, but there's insufficient training, particularly for buyers. They still think that, despite the number of interventions that have been placed. They say it's difficult to navigate the complexity of the jargon and the constantly changing terminology. We've had, various acronyms in there, a variety of different things. And indeed, we have what they complain about is a kind of one-size-that-fits-all procurement process. So we use this metaphor of it wasn't us, it was the respondents used this metaphor of a boxer. So boxers are divided into different weight categories. But of course, in procurement, we seem to have heavyweights going up against lightweights all the time. And therefore, that presents a feeling that the fight is rigged from the start. They're getting fighting fit and kind of ready for business. Is a bit of a mugs game because the heavyweights tend to win most of the time. So that leaves a bad taste in people's mouths. So how it works in practice, we have quite an onerous and tender process in reporting. It's not especially accessible to social enterprises. There is a kind of sneaking admiration for a lot of private sector procurement, which is a lot more straightforward, at least in their eyes. I'm not convinced it entirely is. Very often private sector procurement is based upon existing supply chains, etc. And it's quite difficult to penetrate existing supply chains, but that's the conception anyway. They also think that the procurement teams on both the supplier and the buyer sides can be quite overwhelmed. Although there was an attempt to increase skill sets and knowledge, etc., within public sector commissioners and procurement officers, that's not really translated. It's translated into practice to a certain extent, but it's certainly not fulfilled its ambition yet in terms of what the policy dictated. So what they felt was that people then fall back into kind of lazy habits, and that tendering processes are still very bureaucratic, that repeatedly giving the same information can be time consuming, very costly to businesses, and having to quote for every single tiny item is time consuming. Perhaps there's something to be said there for the level at which they procure at. And there also is still a significant power differentials, as a master-servant almost relationship between the parties here. And effectively everything comes back to price at the end of the day, which is disappointing. Something around the scoring of tenders is that price is still scored higher than social impact. I mean, that might be a statement of the obvious, but sustainability, is often considered kind of just a tick box exercise. It's very kind of short-termism in terms of the thinking here. And the teams are working in silos, so local authorities, procurement teams work separately from policy commissioners and policymakers. So effectively, this creates a disconnect between policy rhetoric and policy practice. So I'm rounding up now. So what we found was that there was quite a number of kind of desires for the future, if you like, in way of making this a lot more real than it currently is at present. effectively, they were talking about this being more about enforcing laws. Unfortunately, it's not unfortunate, it's just the relationship between central and local government. Is it central government's been driving a lot of this, so the Scottish Government has been driving this. But there's quite an interesting relationship between central and local government in Scotland, which is patchy, shall we say, across the country. So forcing local government to do anything is almost impossible. So what you find is that people present different experiences depending on where you are in the country, which obviously is counter to the policy itself, which is about opening up and creating equal opportunities for all. People would prefer to have a much more pragmatic and I suppose approach to monitoring and evaluation. But interestingly, they also talked about monetizing social value, which frankly I've written on quite extensively, and I think this has unintended consequences. So what I mean by that is that when you make a case for social value, that there some kind of monetary proxies are used in order to estimate that's in using a currency, in this case money, and that way that it can be taken account of in a way that everyone understands on a kind of equal basis, if you like, from the actual money, if you like. People have been arguing for that, but as I said, I'm not convinced that that's entirely the answer. I think probably a greater appreciation of what social impact actually means is probably more appropriate. People are hoping that contracts could be awarded to social enterprises directly. This doesn't always necessarily happen. Very often there are, they go to various tiers of procurement and social enterprises, particularly when we talk about community benefit clauses, is that you have a first, a prime tier contractor who are then obliged to have a contractor which provides the social stuff, if you like. And they're depending, and once of course the money goes out of government to a prime contractor, then there's an element of control that's lost in terms of who they contract with and on what basis. And then finally, it's about more input in the shaping of future procurement policy at all levels. This is making the new public governance that Jo mentioned much more tangible and real. And at the moment, it's more at the basis of rhetoric than reality, one could argue. So that's me, short and sweet. This is me. You can contact me if you want to ask any more questions. Obviously, I'm here anyway, so I'm happy to answer any questions you have. And thanks very much, Jo. I'll hand back.
Thanks, Michael. And over to Emma, and I will share screen for you, Emma.
Thank you. Thank you, dear Michael. Thank you, Jo. Hello, dear and lovely people. I had got a very interesting role in terms of the research component, which is trying to mesh Indigenous methodologies with mainstream research methodologies. Part of that is also about connecting up with local Victorian Aboriginal businesses. So for me, we can just skip straight over to that one. Deeply listening is more than just consultation. I've got to admit that I haven't been successful in that as what I would like. I've had some disruptions myself over the past year, but Victorian Aboriginal businesses have still responded to the issue of social procurement, which I'm entirely grateful. And it is thanks primarily to intermediate organisations that are there to mediate policy and help local Victorian Aboriginal businesses find success. I'm not all for universalisms, but one of the incredible strengths of working with Victorian Aboriginal businesses is the nature of relationality. Be able to have integrity and respect for each other and the purpose of social enterprise, business and entrepreneurialism. And yet that aspect, which is so valued in government policy, is really unequal when it comes to terms of the power imbalance between large tendering organisations and small Victorian Aboriginal businesses. Overwhelmingly, Victorian Aboriginal businesses see the policy settings around social procurement as valuable, necessary, and engaging, yet the practice is full of barriers. It is hugely surprising, not to Victorian Aboriginal businesses, but it's hugely surprising that a policy that is set up for inclusion and diversity and understanding has actually created more hoops, barriers, and jumps for Victorian Aboriginal businesses to be engaged in social procurement than other organisations. There's a frustration in the fact that a very thin black skin can be put over a policy that actually hides some deep barriers. So this is what we call black cladding. These are things like where the relationality comes in down the line spends. So it's not just about business in front of you, but how that benefits deeply communities, countries, and partners behind that. And so often we don't have accountability towards the down the line spend, which actually prevents more and the growth in Victorian Aboriginal businesses. It's hard when you write a policy based on the cultural strengths and assets of Victorian Aboriginal businesses and the deep desire to impart relationality in business relationships and other collaborations, partnerships and networks. But again, it comes down to price. The economic argument often overrides and outweighs the social cultural benefit of engaging with Victorian Aboriginal businesses. And what we did find in chatting with Victorian Aboriginal businesses is that they're so creative and innovative and know exactly how to fulfill contracts and the big social problems. And yet the policies are a barrier in terms of embedding the discrimination around the power imbalance. So things like unbundling contracts that allow smaller Victorian Aboriginal businesses that are working on country to be able to operate. Instead, asking communities to grow a capacity and a capability that government policy isn't behind and supporting in terms of community needs. Again, there's a certain amount of stereotypes around the policies, which is a real shame because Victorian Aboriginal businesses know the value and depth of what policymakers are trying to do. But unattainable targets such as 100% Aboriginal owned and employed businesses do not reflect the reality of Victorian Aboriginal peoples living, working, partnering in the communities around them. Exclusion in particular means that Aboriginal peoples have often been denied opportunities at different kinds of skill levels. And so other people must fill those roles. But that then, of course, excludes Victorian Aboriginal businesses on occasion from being able to apply for social procurement tenders. And so we have this sense of the aspirational, being inauthentic because it doesn't reflect the conditions on the ground of Victorian Aboriginal businesses deeply caring, first and foremost, about their communities, but a mutual benefit with others around them. There is a great, massive, wonderful opportunity here to work deeply with Victorian Aboriginal businesses, especially through intermediary organisations such as Kinaway, that represents hundreds of Victorian Aboriginal businesses, by moving beyond consultation and working through to co-design. This actually relieves the stress of policymakers and suppliers, and that they don't have to make all their decisions. They can actually take the pressure off by listening to communities and looking at the whole of cultural circumstances, the strengths and assets, the relational underpins, provide a deeper, more enduring value around social procurement. I think I'll just finish that up there, Jo. We'll keep going and have some time for questions on that one.
Thanks very much, Emma. I just wanted to, as I said at the beginning, provide some drawing together of a few threads while also joining with Emma in a resistance to universalism, and really then invite you to, share your questions, comments, etc. with us. First of all, if you had a reaction to some of what we've talked about as you've got it wrong, that's not how it works, or that's not the purpose, or that's not the rules, that's part of the challenge. This is a space in which there are multiple truths at work and multiple experiences in play at all times. And finding the mechanisms, even in a research project, to effectively boundary span in a way that makes sense to and rings true to diverse actors in this emergent field is exceptionally challenging. So going back to Emma's comment, the one overwhelming thing that we've heard from everyone we've spoken to is a profound desire for this to work. And, the promise of the social, cultural and public value that can be created through social procurement to happen. But that said, it is hard work, this navigation of, a form of public management that is centrally guided by competition and bureaucracy, but is actually inviting and requiring collaboration and networks in new ways. And I think a couple of things that I will just add in terms of content, we haven't sought to share with you a great deal of the content. We've spoken with so many people and we've had used multiple methods, but just to pick up on a few things. From the Victorian surveys and workshops and yarn-ups, smaller organisations, both for-purpose suppliers and private for-profit suppliers, do have less access to needed information to make the policy implementation work. But I guess the higher order things, for those of you who are old hands in this and thinking, not hearing anything that's super new, I guess we've got a couple of reflections. One, going to Emma's comments, is that the skill sets around relationality, co-design and collaboration sit quite squarely with the for-purpose suppliers in these processes in both jurisdictions. Clearly, in the Victorian context, that is Victorian Aboriginal businesses and social enterprises, and in Scotland, social enterprises. It's interesting that the policy design and implementation has not picked up on those assets. If we're trying to do work that is actually about disrupting old ways of doing things, why not actually look to where the skill sets lie? And the other piece of that that's become very clear to us is, not surprisingly, and Michael alluded to this in his reflections, everyone's grappling with the way in which social value targets are formed and the way in which social impact or outcomes might be measured. And there are different views on how to do that well. But again, it's an interesting reflection that the full project team had recently, is that those parts of those players in the supply chains, which includes some corporate and tier one suppliers that have expertise in creating social value, and are not being drawn upon in those conversations about how do we frame this. And I think, you know, if your gut reaction to this is competitive neutrality, we can't have these kinds of collaborations and relationships. I think what we need to do is be clear about the importance of separating out policy from the purchasing activities. Clearly, there are some real challenges around maintaining all commitments to competitive neutrality with regard to the actual purchasing, but there's huge scope within the policy making and policy implementation to do this work differently and perhaps better in the way that so far everyone who's spoken to us says they want. So that's my additional reflections. And now we really wanted to open it up to you, and just wanted to flag a couple of things. One is that we have written up a little bit of supplementary information, which we'll be sharing with everyone who's attended today. Again, it's not by any means the full suite of analysis or insights from this, what's already proving to be a rich project contributed to by many people, but maybe we thought that from a policy perspective it might be useful to have a piece of paper to take away from this conversation so that you can share it if you want to. And we now just wanted to open to you. One of the things we did want to note is that we're still looking for some interviewees for the Victorian context, particularly from tier one suppliers. So if you're interested in that, and or, as I mentioned, we are planning to do a series of sense making or making sense workshops early in 2023 with the diverse sources of data we've collected. If you're keen on either, being involved in either of those processes, we have got a small online form that you can fill out, and that will be included in the document we send, but I think one of my colleagues might stick it in the chat function for us as well.